Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 27. Today, Paul and I are delighted to be joined by Dr Stephen Carver, one of the winners of the Inaugural Doylean Honours from the ACD Society in January this year. Stephen taught literature and creative writing at the University of East Anglia and at the University of Fukui in Japan, before leaving academia to work in publishing. He's the biographer of the Victorian novelist W.H. Ainsworth, and his recent publications include The 19th Century Underworld, The Author Who Outsold Dickens, the novel Shark Alley, and the unveiled anthology of new writing co-edited with Ashley Stokes. He's presently writing The Opium Eaters, High Literature and the Art of Addiction for Morton Books, and editing a new edition of Treasure Island for Wordsworth Editions. And yet, he still has time to come on the podcast and talk to us about Professor Challenger. So, Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, and thanks for the invitation.
Hello, Stephen, and first of all, congratulations on winning one of these inaugural Doylean honours.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I never won anything in my life. It's wonderful.
It's an excellent essay and well deserved, quite definitely.
Oh, thank you.
And to start the podcast going, I kind of have to start almost with the obvious question: is how did you first become interested in Conan Doyle's works?
Ooh. Well, I suspect, like most people, it was when I was a kid, and it's got to be Sherlock Holmes, hasn't it? So it was my father and my Aunt Lily who loved telling ghost stories and things like that at family Christmas parties. And there was one when I was a kid, and I remember them talk. I mean, very young. I mean, this was about 1970. I was about 8 or something like 6, 7. And for them, Sherlock Holmes was a gothic experience. I think everything for them was a gothic experience, you know, with this kind of Durham Methodist family. And my parents were quite elderly. So, you know, like my dad was born in 1915 and stuff like that. So a lot of their discourse was quite Victorian, you know, I mean, they joke about Jack the Ripper and the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. And I kind of muddled all that up in my mind. My father talking about the Speckled Band, and I thought, this sounds great. I'm so going to go and read this. It kind of blossomed from them. So I'm afraid I come to you as a Sherlock Holmes reader who demolished most of them when I was a kid. And apart from the stuff that I've kind of returned to academically, I can't talk with much authority about many of the stories. And Challenger kind of moved on from that because of, well, dinosaurs. You know,
you can't go wrong.
No, basically. I mean, my son is the same. The article came about because of my kid bugging me, like, when are you going to write about the Lost World? And I kept bugging Derek, and eventually this Derek White at Wordsworth, and eventually he kind of relented and let me loose on it. You know? But I read the Lost World when I was very young, because it was just the next link in the chain from kind of Edgar Rice Burroughs and Doug McClure films and Aurora dinosaurs and all that stuff. And there was no way to easily see the films, and you know, you just had to wait for something to come on the TV schedule. So you had to read it, didn't you? And I'd always loved it, but I'd never really looked at the other stories until relatively recently. And I must admit, I just sat there thinking, wow, you know, why are these not in print? Why are people not talking about these? I mean, obviously you guys are, but sort of in my sort of formal world in academia, they were largely ignored, really. And in fact, I heard Land of Mist described more than once as unreadable, for example.
Which is quite definitely unfair.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, you can feel the serial nature of it, can't you? I think it's quite pacey, but and the spiritualism. It's Conan Doyle's spiritualism that fascinates me, and as does the subject in general. And I'm going to write about it one day, honest. And it fits in quite nicely with Land of Mist as well, because
absolutely.
I think I gave a bit of a hard time in the essay you referred to, which
well, we'll come back to that in a minute. I think, So I mean, let's start with the character of Challenger himself. I mean, you write quite affectionately about the character of Challenger in the blog post, and I wondered what draws you to him, and what do you make of that personality?
Oh, he's very big, isn't he? He reminds me of the kind of old school professors that I remember at university, which, I mean, I'm sure they're still around, but not the way they were in the 80s. A very interesting group of people, very sort of frightening and irascible and charming and brilliant and funny, and at the point where you got through, your own terror of some of these people, they took you under their wing. I mean, they'd be absolutely wonderful. And he's one of those kind of people. I must admit, I do like, rebels and iconoclasts as well. And his attitude to the mainstream media, as we would call it today, is also rather lovely, isn't it? And not suffering fools gladly, which my dad always said should have been the family motto. He's a great literary character, and it's kind of a shame we've only got the five books, really. And
I think you're right, because I reread the Challenger stories last week just to refresh my memory of them, and the thing that really leapt off the page is how peculiar and wonderfully over the top Challenger is as a character. There's a lovely exchange in When the World Screamed, where he was berating the engineer about well, you claim to be an expert, but actually, I don't trust experts, and it's wonderfully over the top.
And the engineer is saying, meanwhile, it was clear to me I was dealing with a lunatic.
That's it. Yeah, I really like that, and I wondered. I mean, you made a connection as well in the blog post about Challenger and Conan Doyle themselves being almost quite similar personality types.
Yeah, I wish I'd said more about that, because it's occurred since you got in touch and I've revisited this material. I mean, the things that I didn't say I've kind of leapt out, because the way it always does. But I think it's quite clear he's got to be the character with whom he identifies the most. It certainly is not Sherlock Holmes. I mean, he's on the record multiple times complaining about Sherlock Holmes. I mean, I had a look at the Fox interview that he gave. When was that? Was that in 1925? Where he talks about this monstrous growth. I mean, he can't wait to get through the Sherlock Holmes question and get onto spiritualism, which at this point is all he wants to. He's lecturing on this, and he's decided this is a worthwhile use of the remainder of his time. So he doesn't really want to talk about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is his ticket to ride, isn't it? He's got to write these things to make a living, but it's not what he's interested in. And we do him a disservice, really, by forgetting the amount of, amazing non-fiction political work, the spiritual work, which may come across as a bit mad, but is nonetheless fascinating to read. And a lot of other stories that basically don't involve Sherlock Holmes. So, what struck me was a connection I didn't make in the blog was Challenger at the beginning of The Lost World. I mean, the reason that he's bopping journalists on the head is he's being dismissed as a fraud and a crank, and no one will believe him, which is, of course, what Conan Doyle encountered through a lot of his spiritualist writing. And whereas Challenger is treated in exactly the same way, and Challenger is right. the dinosaur wing he's brought back in the photograph are not fakes. It's all completely real. That's Challenger, the scientist. I think with Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes might be Conan Doyle, the PhD, the scientific detective, isn't he? But Challenger retains the scientific genius, but he's the dreamer as well, isn't he? He's the one who'll. You talked to one of your podcasts away with Conan Doyle's approach to science. There are limits to it. So, unlike Verne, he's not writing the scientific romance. He's looking towards the border. What else might be out there? This works for the spiritualist study, which, as far as he was concerned, was incredibly scientific, which you get a lot in the 19th century, don't you? With like William Oliver Lodge and the rest of that crowd, the constant investigation of medium under test conditions, But he's in the middle. I've actually got something I found in The Lost World, and I thought, why didn't I use that in the essay? This is the Duke of Durham. This is in the final chapter. So Challenger returns in triumph to the Queen's Hall, kind of closing the circle from the first chapter. Apparently, the age of romance was not dead, and there was common ground upon which the wildest imaginings of the novelist could meet the actual scientific investigations of the searcher for truth.
Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful? I mean, that's kind of Doyle, isn't it? And it's also Challenger. Challenger the Earth is a living being, not unlike a sea anemone.
Yeah.
And yes, of course it is, and he goes off to prove it. So I think, when you get going back to Land of Myths, I think they become one in a way. I think that the step Challenger has to take is to embrace Conan Doyle's, personal spiritual beliefs. At which point, for me, the novel goes completely off the rails. And then, of course, and I think it's the same for the author, because the following Challenger stories kind of pull a hound of the Baskervilles going back in time, don't they? So before Challenger converts, so we don't have to deal with his spiritualism at all.
Yeah, it's a very odd feature, that reading them again, I do wonder if he had second thoughts about converting Challenger to spiritualism.
I think, I wonder if commercially, yes, but personally, no. I mean, he was so absolutely sure of his. I mean, he said, "I don't believe. I know that this is true." So he probably didn't mind that, and if he did identify with the character, it makes sense to do that. But I think he realised that was possibly a step too far for the fans.
I was really surprised reading them again that there are a lot of sort of epoch-changing moments within the Challenger stories, but you never quite get the payoff to them. So, you discover dinosaurs, but we never really see the after effects of that. And then Poison Belt is an amazing one, and particularly having come through a pandemic, you get to the end, which is all about this stuff about how is humanity going to cope with this amazing life-changing moment. And then again, Land of Mist, you have Challenger, the great scientist, has finally conceded that spiritualism is correct. These are all sort of big moments that never quite paid off, really.
I was thinking about this the other day, and in the context of how much I love that period in popular fiction when not everything had half a dozen sequels attached to it. You know what I mean? It's so. He wrote The Lost World, and that was that. Dinosaurs, job done. So the next one's got to be different. So the next one's kind of apocalyptic, and then on they go. But the downside of that is you kind of think, well, actually, we should have said more. I mean, the heroes all become immensely rich at the end of The Lost World as well, don't they? Because Roxton's found diamonds or whatever, sapphires, is it? Something like that. And the other thing is, perhaps I was thinking how good. Oh, what's her name? Is it Fairfax? The woman who wrote the 1925 Lost World. Marion Fairfax, I think she wrote some of the Stoll Sherlock Holmes films as well, is that she introduced the kind of the monster movie archetype in the script in a way that Conan Doyle actually didn't. I mean, we get the pterodactyl escapes, and there are references to guardsmen seeing it and then being disciplined for being drunk, isn't there? Something like that. And it's last seen sort of flying away. Whereas what she does with it is she has a rampaging brontosaurus going through, central London and eventually kind of trashing Tower Bridge, which is the archetype for this kind of movie, isn't it? I mean, like the King Kong, which, Willis O'Brien, who worked on The Lost World, went on to do 33, is exactly that. Go to the Lost World and then bring the monster back for a long second act climax in a modern city, and then go and destroy a load of modern landmarks. Yeah, Godzilla does it, and They Spielberg even did it in Jurassic World 2, where you get the tyrannosaurs in San Diego. So I thought that was a payoff that he kind of missed, And then I suppose now, if he was doing it now, he would have gone off like Michael Crichton and written loads of them, wouldn't he? There would have been another one where they were in London Zoo and then they escaped or something like that.
Well, you almost get almost. A lot of this stuff is almost throwaway with Doyle, and it is underdeveloped because my favourite sequence in Land of Mist is Lord John Roxton goes ghost hunting.
Oh, fantastic!
He goes ghost hunting in the way that he goes hunting for big game and dinosaurs. And it's a wonderful episode. It's just one chapter, and that's done onto the next bit. And that to me has always been the most memorable sequence in the book.
I agree. It's a good ghost story. And it's got it goes in a very interesting direction as well, doesn't it? Because the priest re-enters the haunted house and talks to the spirit and basically lays the ghost. So the spirit is a very tragic figure who's trapped and angry and scary. And they sort it out. And you also get Roxton taking a shot at it with his revolver, which of course he would. I like. It's very episodic, isn't it? In a way, I think the other two full-length stories aren't. And I think the point of view has something to do with that. Really, it's an open third person, whereas all the others are sort of first person. So you go full third person, you can range around a lot of different characters, and he does. So you've got the Richer experiments in Paris, where it becomes almost a scientific treatise, doesn't it? The subplot about the real medium who's persecuted and the children taken over by the fake. And it's a weird. I mean, writing serials must do that as well, mustn't it? I mean, you get that when you read Dickens. You can feel the necessarily episodic nature. They're not written as novels. They are serials. So they've got to, each bit has got a bit its own unit of narrative. I think that comes up. But I felt with the Roxton ghost hunting thing that he should have written more ghost stories. But
he was always almost on a learning curve with the ghost story. He never, as you say, never really wrestled with the ghost story. He did the gothic story very well, but the ghost story he never quite got a handle on. But the potential is there.
Yeah, I wonder if for somebody who becomes increasingly convinced of the truth behind spiritualism, the ghost story becomes very silly. I'm not sure. Because the Gothic short story sort of like showed a certain amount of commercial acumen as well, didn't they? I mean, this was a genre which was sort of selling at that point. I mean, he's writing stuff when Lefanu is publishing stuff. We're still in a bit of a golden age for this. So Kipling as well, of course. And we go back to the variety of Conan Doyle's abilities as a writer. I mean, while he's writing Land of Mist, he's writing the first volume of the history of spiritualism as well, isn't he?
This is again with the Land of Mist. It's interesting in that you've got three elements almost. There's the scientific treatise element. There's the adventure story element, which he's always interested in, but also the polemicism. And this, as you say, he's writing at the same time he's writing a history of spiritualism. So the polemical purpose often comes to the fore as well.
Is quite late on in his life, so we're sort of a lot of it has been thoroughly discredited by the point that he's writing this. So the Land of Mist is it's one of the few novels you will ever come across that has scientific footnotes, factual footnotes at the endnotes, I think. But anyway, written by Conan Doyle. I mean, and that's written in the first person, and several of them are prefaced with things. I recall a séance that such and such where we saw this, and then he'll list the other witnesses there, because for him it was, the evidentiary approach involved having other people there who were hearing and seeing the same things he was, and that's how he strongly believed that a lot of this stuff was real. Which we should probably talk about, and the Houdini stuff, because Land of Mist is written after he falls out with Houdini, and they don't just fall out. They actively end up sort of in open conflict across the press over what's her name, Marjorie Crand in the Boston Medium. So he's certainly got a bit of an axe to grind, and he's not letting it go. Because spiritualism comes in waves, doesn't it? You've got the takes off like mad in the 1840s and then begins to drop off, and then the First World War, of course, revitalises interest for obvious reasons, and then begins to drop off in the interwar period where he's writing Land of Mist.
So where did your interest in the spiritualism aspect come from?
This is good. My mother was one. I grew up around this stuff. She was, she was the same as Conan Doyle. She was a lapsed Catholic who'd embraced spiritualism. So I can't claim to have attended séances, but I've been in the family home when one's been going on, and my father's been wandering around in the back room muttering because he thought it was all absolute nonsense, but he loved to put up with it because his side of the family were much more rational, but my brothers were sort of all farm labourers descended from sort of Irish immigrants, and it was all very real to them. So that side of my family were very superstitious, and so it was all there. I'm very, very interested in the history of spiritualism, and I am going to write a book about the Fox sisters at some point. That's something else. This opium eaters thing is kind of in the way at the moment. I've got to do that. A few years ago, I got asked to write something about Lefanu for the Hippocampus book. What was it called? Through a Glass Darkly, and I thought everybody's doing the obvious ones. They're doing the ghost stories. They're doing Uncle Silas and this kind of thing. So let's have a look at the sensation fiction. But I don't fancy that. Quite like the Rose and the Key. Let's have a look at the satires, All in the Dark, which is a satire on spiritualism from a guy who wrote and loved ghost stories. And I was completely taken by this and kind of wanted to sort of mesh up what I remembered from being a kid with something a bit more academic. So I kind of plowed, in order to write this piece, I kind of jumped into the history of it and never really stopped, because the stories are just so wonderful. And then, of course, you've got a sort of perfect kind of blueprint for the way any sort of mad belief, religion, ideology gets started. Only it's happened very recently, and it's included people who were very, very clever and perhaps should have known better, i.e. Sir Arthur, because there was a real blind spot there. I find when he always seems such a likable presence in his work, and then I look at the attacks on Houdini and things like that, and think, well, this isn't his finest hour, really, is it? Or the fairies, the fact that he was so easily fooled Am I allowed to say that? I mean, unless we have listeners that are ardent spiritualists and completely believe in it. I mean, I love it in the same way that I love my mother's old faith. You know, I love the romance and the iconography of it, but I don't believe it. Yeah.
I think that's why Land of Mist is so interesting in that respect, because he tries to take so many different aspects of spiritualism as well. And you do have the moments where, you know, there's the missing chapter, which is about a sort of negative ghost, a very evil ghostly spirit, and then there's the fraud, and then there's the people who are, you know, being attacked. There's the domestic abuse chapter, which is really harrowing. Actually,
it's horrible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Has a really rather uplifting ending, doesn't it? I mean, the spirit of the children's mother intervenes, which is something we've certainly seen a lot of in mainstream Hollywood. I mean, this is how Poltergeist 2 ends, isn't it? Grandma and saves the day. You know, that's a great plot device. I like that. I think I said in the blog, it reminded me of The Mysteries of London. You know, kind of in a good way. But it was very raw and violent and a bit sensational, and it's a very dark section, and he doesn't shy away from it. And you can see there's real anger in the persecution of mediums that are not deliberately faking it. I mean, because a lot of them probably did, you know, believe what they were doing was, you know, complete. I didn't think there's an E.F. Benson story about this where. But it's another ghost story device. The fake medium ends up contacting a real ghost. Because I assume, I mean, you know, Jean would have been absolutely certain that all the automatic writing was, you know, coming from, you know, the etheric plane or whatever. And so was Conan Doyle, you know, and we'll look at it as well. Actually, this is a secondary personality kind of coming through. In, you know, a kind of a psychological experiment, isn't it? I mean, like, sort of at the same time that Jean is still practicing automatic writing, a lot of other people as well, the surrealists, are doing it because they want to get a line to the unconscious. I mean, they know exactly what it is. It's not a supernatural presence. They're kind of turning inwards.
Well, I think a lot of that sort of interest in spiritualism, or at least, well, maybe not a lot, but certainly a good part of it, I think, is Conan Doyle being so irritated by the sort of closed-minded scientific ideas.
Yeah.
And that's what you get with, you know, Challenger's called Challenger for a reason, I suppose.
Indeed, yes.
You know, and the other thing, is he obviously gets quite fixated on this, and the other thing that struck me reading the stories again was how much sort of scientific morals play in the background of these stories, but are never quite resolved. So I was really struck by the fact that, well, you mentioned it before, Land of Mist, you discover that actually the reason Challenger is the way he is because of this disastrous experiment in his youth, where effectively he experimented on a couple of people and they died. So you have that, but also the amazing thing in When the World Screamed, where why is Challenger doing what he's doing? He's doing it because he wants the Earth, which is now this creature, to at least recognize the presence of one human, and that human has to be him. And then the last story, Disintegration Machine, you essentially have got Challenger essentially murdering a fellow scientist who he feels is using science for the wrong ends.
A foreign power, or indeed any power, must not get hold of this technology, because they don't save it for the Empire, do they? They just shut it off, and because the world is not ready. But and it's what. There's a wonderful kind of moral question mark over it, because he doesn't really kill him; he just doesn't bring him back.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, technically it's not murder; it's just sort of, I don't know, permanent stasis. And this notion that you can have your scientific pursuit is completely separate from how the science is going to be used. And I would have thought that is exactly how Conan Doyle would have been brought up in his university days. But actually in Disintegration Machine, right at the end of his life, he's saying quite the opposite, which is, no, there are moral consequences to these things. And Nemor, I think he's called, isn't it? Nemor was quite prepared to sell this to an agent that was going to threaten everybody.
But he's of course seen, industrial warfare by that point, hasn't he? And is anticipating an apocalypse as well. So, I mean, rather like Wells, I mean, he would probably see where technology and humanity were going. This being a hobby horse, I have this problem with Dickens as well, who I love. And I am a Victorianist, that's what I was for many years. I got paid for it as well. But you find yourself, do people not realise that there were other writers in the 19th century, many of whom gave him a good run for his money? They may not have had his vision or his talent. And it's kind of like the historical adaptations on TV and film. There's a set that just rotate around. How many more versions of Jane Eyre do you want? How many more Oliver Twists? And so on. And we could be plundering the popular culture of the 19th century, but in fact, it's incredibly difficult to get anyone to care about it.
It is. I mean, it's interesting. You should make the point there about how many more adaptations of Jane Eyre. I mean, one of your specialisms is Ainsworth, and I'm not so familiar with Ainsworth, but I have read Rookwood. And I can imagine that would have been a hell of an adaptation.
Wouldn't it? Or Jack Shepherd. I mean, imagine sort of like Todd Slaughter being Jonathan King or Alan Rickman. I think it would be wonderful, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But very hard to get anything off the ground involving these texts. They're not familiar. They don't have brand recognition. So
even though something like if you are studying as we said with Conan Doyle, his name is now outside the Sherlock Holmes field, getting more accepted. But you've got to, I mean, we're finding this all the time with the podcast, the stuff that influenced Doyle is where you start to get into these writers you're talking about. This is the stuff he grew up on and which shaped him. And writers, Mayne Reid, these sort of writers are all who are forgotten or overlooked. And if you're going to study major figures, you have to look at what they were influenced by, surely. And there's a whole world out there, as you say, to be looked at.
Well, what I found, it was a long time ago now, and I don't think it's changed, is these sort of things are great for your doctorate, but don't really try to do anything else with them, Something up with Conan Doyle, in the academy, his era is sort of modernism, and he's not a modernist. When I was in academic literature, I mean, nobody was particularly. I shouldn't be so dismissive. There'll be howls and protests from people. What about Professor so-and-so's work on Jules Verne or whatever? But people like H.G. Wells. I mean, even Sassoon. Anyone that was still essentially a Victorian realist writer, let's say. And I'm going to be sneaky here and include the science fiction writers in that. Like structurally, they were using the Victorian novel form. For many years, academic literature just really did not care about them. I mean, the century turned on. It began with Conrad and Kafka and Woolf and Joyce, and this is what you study, and this is what is canonized as high literature. So with Conan Doyle, you get, well, he was the guy who wrote the Sherlock Holmes books, and he came into my professional world through the work of Professor Victor Sage, who was one of the early adapters to Gothic studies, who was very interested in post-colonialism and imperial Gothic writing and things like that. So we started to look at things like the Speckled Band, the Sign of Four from that direction. So we'd, and then of course you've got things like Baskervilles, which is overtly Gothic, isn't it? So we would look at it then. But those of us, the Gothic studies people, were in a bit of a tight huddle looking at that terrible thing known as popular culture. you're not supposed to take seriously. Yeah, but this is changing. I mean, I thought the Oxford Gothic tales of Conan Doyle. I mean, that made a big splash when that came out, didn't it? I mean, still, when was that? That was about 4 or 5 years ago, wasn't it? I mean, I wanted to study comics in the 80s. That's why I went to university. I got funded to do an MA thesis on Alan Moore and Frank Miller. This was 88, something like that. And I got the funding, but when I started to talk to my supervisor, he basically said, "Don't do it. The externals will hate it. They won't understand it, and you won't do very well." And I ended up sort of, abandoning that and going off and doing something on, Imperial Gothic writing.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned, Alan Moore there as well. I mean, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen has probably got more references to any of this stuff than anything else I've come across,
Indeed. I mean, he wanted to get the entire history of sort of culture into one world, didn't he, or something? I'm sure if one looked hard, I'm pretty sure Challenger is in there because there are a lot of prose pieces at the end of the collection. There's an almanac, which I think has absolutely everything.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure Challenger pops up in that. I alluded to Watchmen in the blog as well, but I didn't want to give the game away. I suppose we should say spoiler alert for talking about this, because the idea is that at the end of the Poison Belt, the world has seen something truly terrible and unites, doesn't it? Which is the whole point of Watchmen. It's a wonderful Pynchon-esque conspiracy to in fact have the Third World War and get countries working together. And in the real world, of course, that hasn't happened at all. We had the pandemic just brought us together in the slightest. It's got people shouting at each other in the street about vaccines. It's a zeitgeist piece, isn't it? The Poison Belt. It's a very apocalyptic period. So like 1912, 1913, I could feel what was coming, couldn't they? In fact, I think people who were as smart as Conan Doyle were probably surprised it had taken this long for the European empires to collide, really.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned as well about the how Conan Doyle cropped up into your sort of academic life around the Imperial Gothic. I wondered, where does Conan Doyle sit in that kind of pantheon of writers in the Gothic tradition? Do you think he's people recognise him much for his Gothic work now?
I think the Oxford edition was a bit of a breakthrough. It's getting noticed, but probably not as much as it should be. I mean, there's this kind of dissonance between what lots of very wonderful literary critics and scholars are working on, and what anybody else cares about. I mean, in a way, that's kind of why I'm here and not there. I mean, John Sutherland tore my Ainsworth book apart in the TLF. Murder was committed.
Well, if you're gonna be torn apart by anybody, John Sutherland's not a bad one to get torn apart by, really.
True. I always really looked up to him as well. But I think you kind of missed the point, because I was being sort of slapped on the wrist for apparently suggesting that dear old Ainsworth should be regarded as important as Dickens, and I wasn't doing that at all. What I was saying is, hey, look at this other guy. He's really interesting. And he was the best friend of Dickens and Thackeray. And in fact, the whole history of 19th century literature can be seen through him as an editor and a writer. And nobody's ever heard of him. And people haven't heard, well, not many, I suppose. And they don't know about him for a very interesting reason, which is he wrote books about highwaymen, and there was a huge moral panic. And he was kind of excised from, London letters, really, wasn't he? But continued to slog away, making a modest living as a writer for the rest of his life. I mean, it seemed to me like a very good story about someone who, survives by their pen for decades, and is briefly famous, and then just kind of fades away. I mean, it's one of those failure is much more interesting than success kind of stories.
And did he edit Fraser's magazine, Ainsworth? Did he go?
Ainsworth. He didn't edit that. He edited Bentley's Miscellany, so
right.
he replaced Dickens. He was a
That's right.
Fraserian. He was doing stuff for Fraser's when he wrote Rookwood.
Okay.
So his big things were Bentley's, Ainsworth's magazine, and the New Monthly, which he bought off Henry Cockburn. This is, like you said, the kind of the literary culture that Conan Doyle would grow up with.
Yeah.
I think Conan Doyle sent stories to Blackwood's magazine and didn't get them published, did he?
That's
Which
right.
means he'd be reading the tales of terror and all that wonderful stuff that they were printing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I was just thinking about people like, I think Thackeray and Southey and Carlyle were all printed in those, and he directly references those in this wonderful book, Through the Magic Door, about his reading habits and the influence of writers on his work, and they're all in the same things that Ainsworth was in, and others.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, well, that was such a rich period, I guess, to be a reader. I mean, it's like Raymond Williams said that for the first time there wasn't just one defining genius of the age. There was a whole generation of them. The Brontes, Thackeray, Dickens, Disraeli.
And of course, with Doyle, I've got his family are in the middle of this.
Yeah,
with the artistic side, with Richard Doyle and John Doyle, and so they know these people, they mix with them socially, and Doyle's got these. The family legends come down to him of these characters, and Doyle himself told the story about Thackeray sitting young Arthur on his knee. It was actually Arthur's sister. We worked out with the dates, but nevertheless, this is these were big names, and Conan Doyle's proud of his family's association with all these writers and that whole world of that period.
Yeah, I mean, presumably this is what leads him to start writing fiction while he's still a medical student. Sort of a familiarity with that world, and from the inside as well as the outside. I mean, this was,
And we talked about with Blackwoods and so again the Edinburgh background for Doyle, with Blackwoods being an Edinburgh magazine.
Yeah.
That's he goes for it because it's an Edinburgh magazine, but also because it's got all this Gothic stuff that he loves and that he really wants to be. And Poe, of course, was a big fan of Blackwoods. So it all comes together like that.
Yeah. And you get, I think, a feel of Poe in some of the early Conan Doyle short stories. I mean, the Marie Celeste one. I mean, it's an account. It almost feels real, doesn't it? The way that Poe's sort of like loose journalistic style that kind of gives you the impression that you are reading a confession or something like that. And that's what's sort of so wonderful about. I think something else you can learn from reading Conan Doyle is you can learn how to write.
Yeah, absolutely. He's so underrated as a writer.
Yeah, and I mean, as a non-fic scholar and a storyteller, I mean, I love the storytellers who write non-fiction are wonderful because they impose the kind of drama of, onto the narrative. I mean, he's one of those people where you kind of think, how on earth did you find time to do all of this? I mean, incredible, but in the way to structure a story and things like that with Conan Doyle, it's very modern, isn't it? I think this is why people can still read the home stories and get a lot out of them, is because it's not like reading a more sort of outdated Victorian text. It's not something that you're required to kind of wade through. And he doesn't, I don't know, he doesn't waste too much time setting a scene like Thomas Hardy. He doesn't, he'll cut out superfluous material. I think this is where the professional writer, I think, fascinates me, because they're working commercially. One can't be, not that I'm against experiment or anything like that, but I mean, one can't be experimental if that is what is paying the bills.
I always regard him as kind of part of a triumvirate of Scottish writers, all of whom came out of Walter Scott. Stevenson, Buchan, and Doyle all fit that category to me, and they all squeeze so much into their lives, as well as as writing this wonderful fiction. The achievements of John Buck and outside are just incredible.
Yeah.
And again, it's as you said, how do you find the time to do this? And
Yeah. And indeed, Scott. I mean, I assume Conan Doyle would have been a Scott reader. I think you can't come from Edinburgh. And you know, there were several straight historical novels.
The ones that they're never going to kind of get in the popular mold again, but they're well worth reading in terms of the writing. And
this is what you guys are doing, isn't it? I mean, sort of spreading the word. There's a lot of other material to look at. You know.
I was going to ask you one question, Stephen, if that's
Please
all right, which is
do,
about the Doylean Honours Award. And and just how did you feel about receiving this award out of nowhere?
Oh, it was fantastic. It was lovely. It was, I don't know why, but my email goes to my wife's phone. It's something we set up ages ago for some reason. I don't know, I think it was ill or something like that. And just one Monday morning, she said, "Oh, you've got this email from Derek, something about an award." And I was like, "Oh, great, Wordsworth won an award." You thought, "Well, send him me love and I'll have a look at it." Then she would, "No, it's you." And I thought, nah, that's not true. So, and I don't know, it just, it absolutely made my day. And I'm a grumpy old man, generally speaking, you know. I said the only other thing I won a T-shirt from a comic called Toxic magazine in the 70s, which was a spin-off of 2000 AD, and it didn't turn up. It got lost in the post. I never got my prize. So this is the only one I've got. I mean, I'm doing. My son said we should stick it on the wall because it's very lovely.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, I mean, you say that you don't know a great deal about Conan Doyle, but you certainly have enlightened us on different aspects of the people who've influenced him, and also I think your enthusiasm and your love of Professor Challenger really comes through on the blog post and here today. So thanks so much for your time. Thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you, Stephen.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'll continue to listen.
Thanks a lot. Well, I thought that was a wonderful chat with Stephen, and so interesting to hear his wider interests and how they relate and interweave into the story of Conan Doyle's life and work.
Yeah, and cover plenty of ground there, and our perennial favourites of Conan Doyle and dark science, and Conan Doyle and the Gothic, but also Conan Doyle as a cultural figure, and again moving into the wider sphere of his interest, and very interesting comments on spiritualism there. Yeah, fascinating.
Absolutely. So that brings us to the end of this episode. If you want to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please give us a rating or review on your podcaster of choice, or consider becoming a patron on Patreon. So, Paul, what have we got on the podcast next month?
Coming up next, something completely different from what we've been discussing for the past few shows. It's a story called A Foreign Office Romance, which is a diplomatic adventure set in the early days of the Napoleonic Wars, and in some ways it acts as a curtain raiser for the later Brigadier Gerard series.
Yeah, very good. Great. I'm looking forward to doing that one. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.